What are some wholesome historical facts not taught in school? In 2006, while the Ivory Coast was in the midst of a civil war, the opposing sides agreed to a ceasefire so they could all watch the World Cup. The break in fighting paved the way for a peace agreement a year later. During the Revolutionary War, a British general left his dog behind during a chaotic retreat. When the Continental Army found the lost dog, George Washington had a messenger go under a flag of truce to return the dog to its owner. Truly a man's best friend. Abraham Lincoln decided to grow a beard because of 11-year-old Grace Bedell. She had written him that she thought he would look more handsome and less sad with a beard, and women would tell their husbands to vote for him. So he grew a beard and was elected. On his way to his inauguration, he took a train and passed through her hometown in Westfield, New York, and met her. There was another great story of him where a rival politician called him two-faced. He came back with, "If I had a second face, do you think I'd pick this one?" The Formula One Grand Prix in 1976. After Niki Lauda crashed while hitting a barrier and catching a light, rival drivers Arturo Mazzario, Guy Edwards, Harold Ertel and Brett Lunger all stopped their cars and ran to Lauda's aid. There are many such instances of this happening during the 50s right through to the 80s, of championship drivers forfeiting a win to save a rival's life. And then he won his second championship the very next year. He also retired from driving, then came back and won another championship 2 years later by half a point. After a crash like he had, most drivers wouldn't be the same after. But not Niki, though. It just made him stronger. Rest in peace, Niki. During World War II, a German fighter pilot spotted a damaged American bomber, and rather than shooting it down, he decided to escort it to safety. Decades later, the two pilots found each other and became friends. There was a documentary some time ago where a man who'd been a Japanese prisoner of war met the Japanese man who'd essentially tortured him for years. After the war, the former Japanese officer had become a devout Buddhist, and upon meeting his former prisoner, he begged for his forgiveness for all the wrongs committed against him. They ended up good friends. That is a story of humbling examples of redemption and grace. I would love to hear how both of them were able to find the strength to take their respective parts in that story. When the pharaoh Mentuhotep II's harem daughter died around 2050 BC, he mourned. She was only 5 years old. Her tomb, touchingly, was inscribed with the pet name Meat. This is translated to kitten. The Candy Bomber. After World War II ended and Berlin was divided, the UK and US dropped food into West Berlin by plane. One pilot, Gail Halvorson, started to donate his candy rations to the children, and soon other pilots started doing the same. To let the children know that it was his plane, the one with the candy, they would wiggle the plane's wings before the drop. Word spread and more children would come, and it started a new PR campaign and started to change the mindset that Americans had of giving food to Europe. I always thought the story was really sweet. This is a pretty common PR move by the American military in modern times. Candy, music, movies, magazines. It's cheap as crap, life-changing to a child who's never had it. Positive feelings towards Americans from childhood. Yeah, but this guy did it of his own initiative, though. He saw a group of kids with nothing by the airport and gave them a few pieces of gum that they split up, and then when they ran out of gum, the kids that didn't get any sniffed the wrapper. He promised to bring more, and when the kids asked him how they'd know it was him, he told them that he'd wiggle his wings. He went back to the base and got a couple of his buddies to pool their candy rations, and he created 3 little parachutes to drop them. Later, the commander found out and gave his support. He didn't end his candy-dropping career in Berlin either, though. In 1994, he persuaded the Air Force to let him drop hundreds of candy bars over Bosnia-Herzegovina as part of Operation Provide Promise. Another larger drop was planned and executed by Halvorson over Kosovo in 1999. Additional candy drops have been enacted in Japan, Guam, Albania, and across the United States. In 2003 and 2004, he advocated a similar series of candy drops over Baghdad as a humanitarian mission to be a ray of hope, a symbol that somebody in America cares. My friends from the Balkans have told me that the bitter combats of the wars after the breakup of Yugoslavia used to stop because both sides liked watching Mexican soap operas. Ah, Mexican soap operas, the true olive branch. Telenovelas are the best. I watched many drama-filled hours at the laundromat. You don't need to understand a word of Spanish to follow the plot. The India-Pakistan border is one of the most disputed ones in the world, giving rise to the world-renowned hostilities between India and Pakistan. There was a time once, a prominent Indian singer, namely Lata Mangeshkar, had gone to perform a concert for the soldiers there. As soon as the show began, Pakistani troops started firing rounds in the air, yelling obscenities, and said, "We want to hear her voice too!" So the Indian forces turned up the speakers and pointed them towards the border. Pakistani forces returned the favor when prominent Pakistani singers came to perform for them. I've heard that Indian and Pakistani soldiers get together to watch the India vs. Pakistan cricket matches. The only reason the pilgrims stopped at Plymouth Rock was that they were running out of beer. They had to grow barley and hops. Based on Eric the Red's account, the first ritual done in the New World was when a German Balkan oarsman was found praising the berries identical to the ones used for brewing in his homeland. Ringo Starr once decided the Beatles didn't need him and decided to take a holiday with the intention of never coming back. When John, Paul, and George found out, they went all the way to where he was staying just to convince him to come back. As I recall, he got sick of all the bickering during the recording of the White Album, so it's actually Paul playing the drums in the first few songs. When Ringo came back, his drum kit was all decked out with flowers. Pennsylvania was founded by Quakers, who believed that the light of God shined in everyone regardless of ethnicity or religion. They were known for treating the indigenous people relatively well and welcomed the first synagogue in North America in Philadelphia. That is true. They also created the basis for solitary confinement in prisons, so there are some drawbacks. They didn't think of solitary confinement as extra punishment, but as a period to reflect without distraction and determine to build a better life. The idea was that if time for solitary reflection is good, then 24/7 must be even better. So it was born of good intentions and ivory tower thinking rather than extra sadism. There was a dog in World War I that helped snuff out mustard gas, named Sergeant Stubby. They released a movie about him in 2018, I think. The dog was a stray that joined a man on his deployment to France in World War I and saved the lives of countless American, British, and French soldiers. The Polish army had a gosh darn bear fighting on their side in World War II, Sergeant Wojtek the Bear. He's still on the regiment's coat of arms carrying an artillery shell. A very cute, alcoholic, chain-smoking bear. Wojtek was a bear that served in the Polish 2nd Artillery Unit. During his service, Wojtek was a huge morale boost to the men, fighting multiple men in wrestling matches, eating lit cigarettes, and even foiling a Saudi Arabian plot to attack the camp by discovering a spy in the shower. Wojtek's unit was caught in an artillery battle. He looked around and began carrying artillery shells to the launchers like the men around him. For his service, Wojtek was promoted to corporal and was given an honorable discharge. Wojtek was placed in a local zoo where he was known to appear every once in a while. Known to appear at a child's birthday party. Fellow servicemen from his unit were also known to come by and feed him lit cigarettes, where he also sadly died. In his honor, the Polish artillery unit changed its logo to a bear holding an artillery shell. In the Second World War, British Lieutenant General Commander Gerard Broadmead's Roop was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross because a German admiral who witnessed his gallantry in action wrote to the British and recommended the award. There was a huge fight about African Americans using the public pool in Mr. Rogers' actual neighborhood, so he made an episode on his show where he and an African American guest were sharing a kiddie pool and talking about being nice to people even if they look or sound different. He taught a whole generation that racism isn't fair or right. The actor in the show was supposed to be a police officer, and Rogers actually dried his feet. The entire show was a very gentle and very subtle and ultimately very profound way of saying F you to bigots. During the filming of Gone with the Wind in 1939 on the Atlanta movie set, there was a long line of porta potties, each with a sign that said either white or colored. Lenny Blewett, an African-American extra, went to Clark Gable's dressing room and asked to speak to him. Gable immediately got on the phone and yelled at the director that if the signs weren't taken down, then they didn't have Clark Gable as Rhett Butler. And seeing as filming was put off for 2 years just to get Gable, that was one heck of a threat. Apparently Gable even accepting Blewett to enter his dressing room was considered a big thing, as Blewett was so low down the movie pecking order that he was not even going to be credited. I wonder if people back then complained as much as certain people do today when Hollywood got involved with politics. Oh, let's be honest, they always have and they always will. Besides, during World War II, Qantas Airlines has never had a fatal commercial jet plane crash since its formation in 1921. They've never had a single fatal commercial jet crash and haven't had any fatal propeller plane crashes since 1951. They came close in 2010 though, with Qantas Flight 32. And they give beautiful pajamas. Pugs were bred by the Chinese to sit on the laps of emperors. They were quite literally designed to be lazy. The official breed of the House of Orange was the pug. This was because Prince William was alerted to Spanish assassins by his loyal pug, Pompey. How's that for a backup fact? You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out Easy Mode, also linked below, and subscribe. Mr. Rogers always said he was feeding his fish out loud because he heard that a little girl who was blind was worried about them, so he audibly said it so she wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. Not really a historical figure, but one that we all know. Mr. Rogers definitely counts as a historical figure, and you can't change my mind. John Stark, one of the rescuers of the remaining survivors of the Donner Party. Apparently, this 220-pound beast of a man rescued all 9 children by carrying them out of a deep sunken snow pit, and laughed and joked with them the whole time. In Summit Valley, the remaining rescuers discussed what to do and took a vote to only save 2 of the children in starved camp. That might have been all they could manage. The others would have to stay behind. John Stark would not abide that. That meant 9 people, mostly children, would die on the mountain, exposed to elements down in a very deep hole in the snow. John Stark decided he'd save all 9. Already shouldering a backpack with provisions, blankets, and an axe, he picked up 1 or 2 of the smaller children, carried them a little ways, then went back for the others. Then he repeated the process again and again and again. To galvanize morale, he laughed and told the youngsters they were so light from months of mouse-sized rations that he would carry them all simultaneously if only his back were broad enough. Once they were out of the snow, he would eat and rest, he said, but not before. He saved all 9. James Breen, one of those in the pit at Starved Camp, later said, "To his great bodily strength and unexcelled courage, myself and others owe our lives. There was probably no other man in California at that time who had the intelligence, determination, and what was absolutely necessary to have in that emergency." After Commodore Perry forced the opening of Japan to foreign trade, Japan signed many unequal treaties with Western nations. The 1888 Mexican-Japanese Treaty was the first time a Western nation treated Japan as an equal. In the late 1930s, fascism was advancing through the world and no one dared oppose it. Except for Mexico. Mexico was the only country that openly protested against the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Italian and German involvement in the Spanish Civil War, along with the USSR, and finally, the German annexation of Austria. In Vienna, we named the square Mexikoplatz, Mexican Square, in honor of Mexico being the only country that protested the Third Reich's annexation of Austria. Horton Hears a Who was written for a Japanese friend of Dr. Seuss immediately following World War II. He wrote it as an allegory about the importance of forgiveness and humanity, in a time when much of the world was still bitter at Japan for their role in the war. Horton represents the United States who speaks up for Whoville, the Japanese, to remind them that a person is a person no matter how small. During the Crusades, when Richard the Lionheart had a fever, all he wanted at the moment was some fruit and a cold drink. His enemy, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt who had seized control over Jerusalem, heard the news and sent him peaches, pears, and a shipment of ice from a mountain. When he heard that King Richard's horse had been killed, he sent him a bunch of new horses and a stable boy. When boys were shipwrecked on a deserted island, they actually did a great job of solving interpersonal conflict, creating a situation that is essentially the opposite of Lord of the Flies. The boys had set up a small commune with a food garden, hollowed out tree trunks to store water, a gymnasium with curious weights, a badminton court, chicken pens, and a permanent fire. Kolo fashioned a makeshift guitar from a piece of driftwood, half a coconut shell, and 6 steel wires salvaged from their wrecked boat. They lived better than some of us do. Humans are social animals. We generally don't devolve into chaos unless we have to. In 1952, Albert Einstein declined an offer to become the second president of the State of Israel. Napoleon was once nearly killed by being trampled by hundreds of rabbits. He organized a hunt to celebrate a victory, but the guy got tame rabbits instead of wild ones. Instead of running when released, they looked directly to who they recognized as the guy in charge, Napoleon, because they knew the guy in charge meant food. Long story short, they all charged him. He ran, he got severely trampled, and injured. I couldn't make this crap up if I tried. As a history graduate who loves that period, I had no idea that this had happened. It's amazing and totally in keeping with Bonaparte being a magnificent general to the public and kind of ridiculous in his personal life. There is a Lions student in Venice that has Viking runes graffiti on it. The fact that the message is "Kilroy was here" is so beautiful to me. Norsemen also wrote graffiti on the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, back when it was called Constantinople. It's taught in Ireland, but I don't know about the US. When we had the potato famine, millions of Irish were dying and emigrating, and the Choctaw tribe heard this, and despite being extremely poor, they managed to raise I think around $200. And now we've helped them out and raised $1.5 million to help them with COVID-19. That's about $6,500 in today's money. There's also a monument in Cork called the Kindred Spirit dedicated to the Choctaw tribe that was built in honor of the tribes. Imagine that kind of togetherness on a worldwide scale. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were a few Supreme Court cases about the color of margarine. The dairy industry couldn't compete as well with margarine dyed the color of butter, so some states tried to pass laws saying margarine had to be pink, which the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional. However, they also decided that yellow margarine was defrauding the public. So for a while, margarine was sold white with a packet of yellow dye that you could mix in at home. In conclusion, they couldn't believe it wasn't butter. The family responsible for inventing the method of making margarine yellow during production lived close to my old neighborhood. Friends who would visit would ask about their huge house, and I always found it hilarious to explain how they got most of their wealth. Benjamin Franklin loved butterballs. Also, flatulating, naturalism, and doing the deed with old ladies. I mean, yeah, but who doesn't love those things? Tutankhamun's most prized possession was his meteoric iron dagger. Museum visitors are impressed by the gold instead. In Tutankhamun's day, meteoric iron would have been rare on an unimaginable scale, whereas gold was the standard currency every merchant had had. In the present day, anyone with $20 can buy meteoric iron trinkets on Etsy, whereas gold is hardly seen in quantities larger than a ring or necklace. On Christmas Day 1914, both sides of World War I celebrated Christmas together with songs and games. This type of celebration happened over the whole front in Belgium and France. The soldiers talked to each other like they weren't in war together. Many soldiers wrote in their diary that they didn't expect the enemies to be so kind and friendly, and that they wanted to meet with them when the war was over. But a few days later, the leaders of the armies found out about the celebrations and forbid any future meetings between the two sides. There were a few attempts to reconnect during Easter and Christmas, but the soldiers who attempted were punished or killed. An actual true fact about Liechtenstein is that Switzerland accidentally invaded Liechtenstein during a Swiss army exercise, when some soldiers got lost and accidentally walked into Liechtenstein, on two separate occasions. So Switzerland has accidentally invaded Liechtenstein twice. The Chicago Public Library originated with a donation of books from Queen Victoria following the Great Chicago Fire. She assumed the city's library had been burned down. Homework was originally a punishment for bad students, and now it's a regular thing. Pirate ships were actually pretty great, relatively speaking. They were very democratic, and pirate crews were pretty well cared for. Also, they took assault against women pretty seriously, i.e., they killed you for it. Also, pirates were really rare. The vast majority of seafaring raiders were privateers, which were basically mercenary ships who were hired by a country to attack the shipping of an enemy nation. If you kept everything for yourself, pirates. If you paid your fair share to your monarch, privateer. There was a Scotsman named Bill Millen who stood on the beaches at Normandy during D-Day, calmly playing the bagpipes as shells and machine gun fire streaked past him. The Germans didn't shoot him because they figured he must have been insane. Pipers had traditionally been used in battle by Scottish and Irish soldiers. However, the use of bagpipes was restricted to rear areas by the time of the Second World War, by the British Army. Lovat, nevertheless, ignored these orders and ordered Millen, then aged 21, to play. When Private Millen demurred, citing the regulations, he recalled later, Lord Lovat replied, "Ah, but that's the English War Office. You and I are both Scottish, and it doesn't apply." When persecuted Zoroastrians from Persia came to the kingdom of Sanjan in the west coast of India as refugees, the king wasn't sure that he wanted to offer them refuge, so he sent them a full glass of milk, implying his kingdom was full. The leader of the Zoroastrians added some sugar to the milk and sent it back to imply the refugees would become part of the kingdom and make it sweeter. They got to stay, and though they're a micro-minority, they're one of the most successful communities which has left its imprint on every aspect of India. Under a Supreme Court ruling in the 1800s, tomatoes are considered a vegetable because you can't make a dessert out of them. The ruling came from California having tariffs on fruits because at the time it was believed that only people with a bit of wealth could buy fruit, because they're only really used to make a dessert. Tomatoes were part of the tariff, so people protested, and the Supreme Court removed tomatoes from the tariff, meaning they aren't a fruit in the eyes of the law. I was on vacation in Germany over spring break. They have these frog fences. These fences keep the frogs from crossing the roads and getting run over. At the end of the day, somebody comes and gathers the frogs and helps them across the road. Not only in Germany, and fences are not only to keep the frogs safe, but also the drivers. So many frogs might pass a stretch of road that it gets slippery from all the crushed frogs and somebody could get hurt. But where I live, they started installing blue reflectors on the road markers which are designed to warn wildlife, mostly deer, and keep them from running onto the roads. Captain Morgan actually existed. The face of the well-loved rum, Captain Morgan brand, was a real guy. He was a Welsh privateer who fought alongside the English against the Spanish in the Caribbean in the 1660s and 1670s. His first name was Henry, and he was knighted by King Charles II of England. His exact birth date is unknown, but it was sometime around 1635. He died in Jamaica in 1688, apparently very rich. Henry Morgan is largely regarded as one of, if not the greatest pirates who ever lived. When you run down the list of notable pirates whose names you recognize today, like Black Bart Roberts, Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, Calico Jack Rackham, Charles Vane, and the others, they all had one thing in common. Not a one of them lived to enjoy much, if any, of their ill-gotten gains. They were either killed in battle, captured and wound up dancing the hempen jig, or left to rot in a gibbet. Henry Morgan actually won the game of piracy, if you consider the end goal to get rich and live the good life, by actually retiring, receiving a royal appointment as governor of Jamaica, bought a plantation, and spent his remaining years actually enjoying his wealth and drinking with his friends. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out Easy Mode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.